Place is the combination of people and geography. It defines who we are and how we experience the world. For me, growing up in Boulder, Colorado, walking to and from school in the shadow of the Flatirons, my place was a consistent home with the mountains in the west. For my mom, who moved to Colorado so my dad could attend grad school, Boulder became a place of sacrifice. She raised my brother and me there to maintain our stable life, even though she was far away from her family in Michigan. When I started teaching in the closest school in New York City to the ocean, I didn't think anything about the errors or the possibilities of teaching in a place just feet from the beach, like whale sightings, or the historical trend of pushing marginalized communities out to places at the edge of the city. Teaching in Chicago and then East Williamsburg, I was used to living in places of relative privilege and then traveling a few miles to a world different from mine. So when my colleague told me she was going to be a new principal at a reconstituted school in the Rockaways, I chose the exciting possibility of starting a new school in a distant place, relative to Cobble Hill, over an easy commute. 8 years into teaching, my new school, Waterside, was similar to the other schools I'd taught at. But now, when I went to the bodega to get a sandwich, there was a good chance the person in front of me was in a bikini. Kind of a bummer every September and June. In October 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City and hit my section of the Rockaways especially hard. Fires decimated the apartment complex across from my building. Its replacement has still not been completed. Floods wrecked our school's boiler. Its replacement is still sitting in a trailer outside our building. And there was a mountain of garbage hundreds of feet high in nearby Reese Park. That pile has since been cleared. My neighborhood, now in South Brooklyn, suffered relatively little damage, and New York City went back to school a week after the storm. The kind of stability that I had enjoyed and my mom sacrificed to give me had been robbed from my students and many of my colleagues in an instant. Even worse, no one knew when stability would return. Unable to go back to our building, our new home was August Martin High School in Jamaica, an imposing building with metal detectors at the entrance. The classrooms we were assigned had long been unused. In this new place, we had to start from scratch by literally trying to track down our students, calling parents one by one. At least half of my students weren't in their homes. They were staying with relatives or in shelters. I found out that 2 of my students were in Brooklyn. I knew that good teachers meet students where they are. In this case, that meant getting them to school. Without hesitation, I offered to pick them both up and drive them to our displacement school. On the first day, I picked up Tyshawn and Brianna, nervously clutching the wheel as I was responsible for driving 2 7-year-olds across Brooklyn. Tyshawn would always fall asleep and sleep for the whole ride, whether because a moving car soothed him or he wasn't sleeping enough at home, I never knew. Brianna spent rides telling me about how she was worried about her newborn baby brother and that her grandma's apartment only had 1 bedroom for 6 people. Our first day at August Martin, about 85 students showed up out of our student body of 450. As the first snowfall of the year began, some kids arrived wearing sweatshirts instead of coats. We did our best to make them feel safe and comfortable, arranging for them to enter through a side door so they could be greeted by familiar faces instead of metal detectors. The whole staff had solicited donations, and one whole classroom was filled with clothing, blankets, and supplies. Jonathan, whose apartment had burned in the fire, was staying in a shelter, and I helped him collect new clothes for himself and his little brother. That first day, students trekked home in the falling snow, carrying donated supplies. Many kids were spending cold, dark nights at home without power or heat, or squished into apartments with too many people. They needed extra love at school, but I tried to mix academics with trauma care. With very few books and no whiteboard or projector, I had to improvise. I remember opening a file cabinet in the classroom and finding a file from 1973 filled with mimeographed worksheets. Though we had only changed places, it felt like we had traveled back in time and had to teach in the simplest way possible. With so few kids showing up, we put all the classes in each grade together in one room and rotated kids through subjects. The 4 teachers on my grade team each took one corner of the room and whispered our lessons to groups of students gathered around in big desks with their feet dangling or sitting in circles on the cold tile floor. We had to go back to the basics in all ways. from figuring out how to get kids to school, to creating a lunchroom, to making sure kids had clean clothes. It only made sense that we needed to focus on the basics academically. We knew we wouldn't be able to cover all of our standards that year. Should we teach measurement or move on to multi-digit addition? We made choices like these every day. Though I didn't spend much time directly on the storm, as I thought kids needed a sense of normalcy, many expressed their trauma through writing. Jonathan, whose apartment had burned down and who would have periods of sullen silence when asked to do tasks, wrote a poignant poem. He wrote, "The wind robbed my toys, the wind robbed my clothes, the wind robbed my happy." After only a few weeks of being displaced, we were lucky to be able to return to our building. Though we were back in a familiar place, we returned to a new kind of school, where we greeted fewer students than before. Jonathan's family was still in a shelter, and he continued to attend our school for another few months. Then they found a new apartment. I hoped his new teacher understood what he had been through, and that his silence or refusal to do his work wasn't defiance, but just a little boy trying to cope with having lost everything and needing to assert some control. Brianna's family was able to return to their apartment. She stayed at our school and thrived. Her little brother is a first grader now, who I get to smile at in the hall every day. Tyshawn moved shortly after the storm to another state. Just last month, I got a message from a former colleague who now works in LA. She has students who've lost their homes in the wildfires and wanted to know how best to help them. As disasters more frequently displace entire communities, we educators need to be prepared to maintain stability when our students' place in the world is in flux. By teaching what we thought the kids needed most, we were able to focus on the students in front of us, not the tests or the quality review or any of the other things that often get in the way. Going back in time may be what our kids most need us to do when they lose their place in the world. And since most of us have at least one student going through trauma in our classrooms, we all teach through storms, seen and unseen, every day.